Okay, welcome to part 2 of our Advent series on the encounter of Greco-Roman culture and the advent of Christianity. So I guess I should we'll wish everyone a Merry Christmas at the end. And Happy Hanukkah too, because we'll also be discussing in this session the Maccabees and stuff. But anyway, I should first let you say hello to my friend and colleague, Miles Smith. You want to say hello to everybody, Miles?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's great to have you with us for part 2. Before we get to the thrilling, bracing story of the Maccabees and their valiant revolt, Alex, in part 1, we did a couple of things. We explained to people that we wanted to cover an aspect of the classical tradition, classical learning that's sometimes overlooked, which is theology. And so we looked at the classical world, mostly Greek theology. The word itself is Greek. And we looked at its affinity with Judaism up to a point and the way it prefigured Christianity. We also briefly told people about our courses. That's at the beginning of most of our videos. But very quickly, Alex, if somebody wants to go into more depth than we cover in these podcast videos, short chats, what would they do? Would they contact you by email?
Yes, the email is on the bottom of this video. So just send me an email if you're interested in any of our courses. We have a course on classical philosophy and the virtues. We have one on Nietzsche and Socrates, one on rhetoric, looking forward in 2018 to one on Greek drama. So we have a fair number of offerings, and if you're interested in any of them, just email me.
Excellent. And for today, Alex, as we carry on from the material we just briefly described from part 1, what are we going to look at in our discussion this time?
Yeah, so basically, I've entitled this From Conflict to Confluence, right? So we have the meeting with Alexander the Great and his successors of these two distinct cultures, right? The Greek culture, which was the first great civilization of Europe, and its encounter with Semitic monotheism, first in Israel, and then with Christianity, which ultimately converts the Greco-Roman world, right, and inherits both the biblical tradition and the Greco-Roman tradition. And so we can basically say this is really foundational for European Western civilization as a whole. So I think that they're very important. They're very important themes. So I think the first should probably just say a few things. Those of you who want to look at the Greek philosophers and the Greek poets to a degree and their notions of the divine, I would invite you to look at part 1 of these series and the development of what we could call speculative theism or philosophical theism in the Greek world, right, in terms of the way in which the Greek philosophical mind explored the notion of the divine and the soul and so forth, right? We sometimes have too restrictive of a view of what Greek rationalism was about. But we should also mention that as Greece was developing, and even in the centuries previous, in the Middle East, you had the emergence in Israel of the world's first monotheistic civilization. And it's just important, I think, to mention some of the distinctive features of that civilization before we discuss the encounter with Alexander the Great. So I think one of the things that one notices if you look even cursorily at the biblical narrative is that God is not treated so much as a metaphysical principle as in the Greeks, but as an active person, right? A person in history who creates the world, creates mankind, enters into, he calls Abraham, right? There's this dialogue, I think Martin Buber called the I thou, right? He calls Abraham out of Ur. He brings Israel out of Egypt. He intervenes in the world with mighty wonders. He gives Israel a law and a covenant. right? And intervenes continually, right? When Israel in the biblical narrative is unfaithful to its covenant, prophets are called to warn them of God's impending judgment and so forth, right? So it's, we could say, a different approach to God. And throughout the history of Christianity, one of the big questions has always been, what is the relationship of the God of the Bible and the God of the philosophers, right? And so in a figure like Thomas Aquinas, we won't get into all the details, but a figure like Thomas Aquinas, you have the effort to reconcile these two images of gods. Other figures like Pascal and some of the Protestant reformers saw much more tension between these two figures, like Luther called Aristotle a blind heathen and this sort of thing. So this whole question has been one which has run through Western civilization. Now, I think an important thing to mention is the strict monotheism, which included the abhorrence of any sort of polytheism, right? I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, right? So Israel had a very strong aversion, inculcated aversion to the worship of anything other than God. And even the representations, because of the fact that art was often used by the polytheistic religions which surrounded Israel, were frowned upon, right? So there's precepts against graven images and this sort of thing, right? Which you see also today in Islam as well, right? As a certain aversion to iconography. But anyway, but this very idea is an exclusive covenant between God and Israel. And so this will factor also when we discuss the relations, sometimes fraught, between Greece and Israel. So Alexander the Great, we'll move on to Alexander the Great. But I guess I should ask Miles, is there anything you wanted me to touch on before I move on to Alexander the Great and the first encounter, as it were?
No, I think the plot you've charted is a great one. Just perhaps in terms of where this fits other discussions we've had or that people may be familiar with. In some ways, this discussion today and in the previous installment is an unpacking of the Athens and Jerusalem theme, which has preoccupied a lot of scholars that we've touched on in a separate video. But one thing that comes to mind, just in terms of the difference between the God of the philosophers, or certainly the God of the Greeks, and the God of the Bible, that may be worth stressing briefly, is the absence of cosmic strife. So that in Greek speculative philosophy, as you move from poetry to philosophy, there is an increasing emphasis on the justice and truthfulness of the gods or God, but there is often a narrative of begetting and devouring and striving, whereas the God of Genesis does not have any rival to speak of at all, and he makes the world out of nothing but his will and his reason and his benevolence in perfect harmony. And perhaps that's worth mentioning just because it's something which, in terms of the confluence of the classical tradition and the biblical tradition, can be understood philosophically. So it enriches philosophy, and philosophy can help clarify it to the human mind, but it's something not discovered by the philosophers, and it's something that revelation does offer. Is that fair? Or
yeah. Now it's also in late Judaism and in Christianity, you see the emergence of the Satan figure, which one can think of in terms of a different mode of strife. But you're absolutely right. If you compare Hesiod's theogony, you don't have anything like the Titanomachy of one group of gods overthrowing the previous group. And of course, the gods are also sexual. They have consorts and stuff like that, which is also a difference. Maybe one of the most fundamental differences one should think of is that the Greeks conceived of almost every possibility, but the one thing they could not conceive of is something from nothing, right? So the idea of the creator God, right, that there was the divine will that brought the whole universe into being, was probably not something that they considered, because of the principle in Greek thought that nothing comes from nothing, right? So in all their notions of the divine, it's more things like emanation and these sorts of patterns, right? Where, or the demiurge fashioning things out of pre-existent matter and this sort of thing, right? But the idea of an absolute beginning was probably not something that they conceived of. Okay, so Alexander the Great is one of those epical figures, right? It's probably fair to say that before Alexander the Great, you know, if you look at Herodotus and so forth, the Greeks thought of themselves as radically distinct from the peoples of Asia, and in fact in conflict with them if you look at the Persian Wars and stuff like that. So you had the strict division between the Greeks and the Barbaroi, right? The barbarians, right? These worlds of Europe and Asia were sort of separate worlds. Alexander the Great conceives of the idea of the conquest of Asia, right? Which for the Greeks meant primarily what we would today call the Middle East, although he went as far as Afghanistan and India, you know, the borders of the Indian civilization and so forth. And so this is really Alexander's rapid conquest of the entirety of the Persian Empire. He left at the age of, what, 19 or 20 or so, and dies in his early 30s, and he had conquered a great part of the known world without having lost a single battle, right? And his dream is, well, partly the marriage of East and West, right? So there's a synthesis between the Asiatic and European or Greek cultures. So that's one element, and also just the general idea of spreading Hellenism, of spreading the Greek culture to the peoples of the East. And so if one merely thinks about the fact that Hellenistic culture lasted minimally to the rise of Islam in the 7th century, right? So that's about 8-9 centuries later, not to mention its continuities with the Byzantine culture and so forth, right, that lasted even longer. It was one of those really epical events. And so the key theme here is the spread of Hellenism, right? The spread of the Greek culture to the peoples of the Middle East. And this had, I should say, politically, Alexander, well, supposedly they asked him who he wanted his empire to, and not very auspiciously, he said, to the strongest, which meant that his generals pretty much divided the empire very early on, with Egypt coming under his general Ptolemy, and the Seleucids taking much of the rest of it. So that part was not, so it was not very cohesive, but politically, but culturally, there's a unifying theme in this idea of the spread of Hellenism. So the city that Alexander built in Egypt becomes Alexandria, right? Which is still a city. And Ptolemy builds there the Library of Alexandria, right? And according to sources from the age, that it housed about 500,000 scrolls, right? Basically what the Library of Alexandria wanted to do is unite all knowledge of the world into one place. And it became this real center for Greek thought and scholarship, so that you had figures like Euclid and Archimedes, right? Euclid, the most important figure in the systematization of geometry, right? And Archimedes, perhaps the greatest scientist of the ancient world, and all these various scholars and scientists and mathematicians gathering in this one place, right? And this becomes one of the ways in which Hellenism spreads, to the attractive force of Greek culture. And you also had large numbers of Jews who left, who moved to Alexandria, right? And so you have the emergence of the Hellenized Jewish community. You even had the first Jews in Europe, right, moving to Greece during this time. I think there's still remnant communities, Romaniotis, right? The earliest Jewish communities. And these were, just like many Jews today might speak English, right? Instead of Hebrew or Aramaic, right? You had Greek-speaking Jewish communities emerge. So you have the beginning of an interaction that way. The Hellenized, we could say Hellenized Jews who were Hellenized to various degrees. You have also I think it was supposedly in the toward the end of the 3rd century, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, right? The Christian Old Testament, which was called the Septuagint. According to at least the Jewish accounts, they were 72 scholars who worked on the translation. I think that's the origin of the name. And so you have and this was supposedly for the Library of Alexandria. They wanted a record of the Bible. And so you have the beginning of citations of the Bible, right, among Greek scholars as well. You have Werner Jaeger, the German classicist, wrote about the first Greek references to the Jews under Aristotle's successors, Clearchus and Theophrastus. I think Theophrastus referred to the Jews as a philosophical race, right, because their concept of God was without any representation, perhaps, right? So you have the beginning of these kinds of interactions, right? Those are, of course, the friendly element of the Greek-Jewish interaction. In the Seleucid period, during the 2nd century BC, you had, under Antiochus Epiphanes, right, a more forcible effort at Hellenization, right? So Antiochus brought according to the Book of Maccabees, probably the most important historical source we have for this, he brought the statue of Zeus into the Jewish temple, which would have been to the Jews a great no-no, and tried to compel the Jews to offer sacrifices to the Greek gods. And this triggered a revolt, which was the Maccabean Revolt. So Mattathias said, they offered to Mattathias, the father of Judas Maccabeus and so forth, right, that he would be honored with silver and gold if he would try to convince his people to offer these sacrifices. And he said, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to do his commandments, departing each one from the religion of his fathers, yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenant of our fathers, right? We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. So this was really the beginning of the Maccabean Revolt, which was also generally thought by scholars to be also kind of a civil war between the Hellenized Jews and the Hebraists, we can call them. Anyway, the war was initially quite successful and created the first independent Jewish commonwealth. Oh, no, sorry. I should say the last independent Jewish commonwealth before the creation of the state of Israel in the 20th century. It was also, we should say, at various points assisted by the Romans, and it became increasingly a Roman common client state, we could say. Increasingly, as time goes on, as Rome's power rises, the Romans, of course, trying to weaken the strength of the Seleucids in the Middle Eastern region, so that by the time of Herod, it is effectively it's real independent. The real independence of the Herodian state, let's say, it could be questioned. Let's put it like that. Okay. Now, there's a number of things that this does within the Jewish community, right? So you have those who see themselves as Hebraists and who see the Hellenized Jews as sort of unfaithful to the covenant in some sense, right? And I should say that there are various levels of Hellenization, right? So there were some Jews who continued to practice Judaism. I mean, the most extreme level would be those who actually worship the Greek gods, right? But which apparently existed. But there were also those who continued to observe Judaism, but they were basically Greek-speaking and immersed in the Greek culture. So there were various levels, right, in which this phenomenon could exist. But it was from so you had a counter movement, anti-Hellenist movement. Sometimes it was violent. It used force like the Maccabeans, but other times you had also the Hasidians, who many people think were the ancestors of the Pharisees, right? Who emphasized the study of Jewish law as being the most important thing. They believed also in this idea of an oral law, which was more expansive, and is really the origins of perhaps of rabbinical Judaism. So you had those who were sort of zealous for the law. Now, the last thing I should mention about this pre-Christian interaction with Judaism, although we're already crossing into the AD period, is Philo-Judaeus, who's part of this Alexandrian Jewish community. And he interprets, he has a logos theology where he says that God creates the world through the Platonic logos, right, effectively, right? So we have this assimilation of the logos concept already into the Jewish thought of the time, right? At least strains of Jewish thought. So I think what's important to mention here is that this world in which we have the continued existence yeah, I should mention one thing. When Herodotus dies, yes, I should mention one thing on the history side. When Herodotus dies, the Romans establish a Roman procurator, right? So that was really the end of Jewish independence at that point. So this world where you have Roman political rule, Greek cultural supremacy, a Hellenized Eastern Mediterranean, and the continued existence of Judaism, right, struggling in some sense for cultural independence, is the world in which Christianity was born, right? So in a sense, between the two worlds, right, coming from the Jewish world, but at the same time, the Gospels are all written in Greek, right, which is an important point. And they were gaining most of their converts from the Greco-Roman world. So we have sort of the world in which Christianity emerged, which is probably a good pausing point. Miles, was there anything else you wanted to think about or mention?
No, I mean, I think that helps really pave the way, not just in terms of the historical precedents, but, you know, people thinking about St. Paul or, you know, other Christian key quotes, so to speak, would think about the saying, you know, in Christ there is neither Greek nor Jew. So this idea of an identity which clearly swims in two waters, you know, as you said, the Roman Empire, but really is still a Greek culture and a Jewish religious base. That's the crucible, so to speak, in which we get started. So I think you're well teed up.
Yeah, and if you think about it, St. Paul embodies all those things almost perfectly, right? Because who is St. Paul? He is a Roman citizen. He's a Jew zealous for the Pharisees, in fact, an opponent of early Christianity, right? Zealous for the law, right? And thus thoroughly immersed in the religious law of Judaism. He's comes from Tarsus, which is a Greek-speaking island. So he speaks Greek fluently, right? And all of his writings are in Greek, right? So, and he's constantly writing to the Corinthians and the various Greek churches which are being established. So he's really the perfect conduit, right? And so you have this emergence, what the Christians would later call the tertium genus, right? Neither Greek nor Jew, but in another sense, including both of those within their identity. So I think that's kind of an important idea. And I think you could see some of these tensions in Paul's own writings. Okay, so give you an example from the first letter to the Corinthians, right? Here he's talking about the wisdom of the Greeks, right? And he says, "Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men, right? So you have this idea, well, one could imagine that to the Greek world, with its, on the one side, philosophical concern for philosophical wisdom, and on the other side, it's God's always robed in majesty and honor, right? The idea of this crucified carpenter might seem like folly to them, right? But he's saying but Paul is saying that God's wisdom is greater than human wisdom, right? That the wisdom of the world is different from the divine wisdom. God acts, as it were, in unexpected ways, and you have this idea of a historical revelation. But then at the Areopagus, right? And what was the Areopagus? The Areopagus in Athens, not far. If you go to Athens today, you'll see it's not far at all from the Acropolis, where the ancient Athenian Supreme Court used to sit and adjudicate. St. Paul gives a speech, right? So he sees an inscription to the unknown God, and he says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Right? So here you have, I think, the roots of a fertile theme in patristic, that is the church fathers' approaches to the Greeks, right? Which is the idea that they had actually, in some sense, worshipped or strived after God unknowingly, right? And that what was hitherto unknown is now revealed, right? So that in a certain way, the Greeks also were prepared for the coming of Christ, right? And this is a fertile theme, and it's surely not coincidental that so many of the early churches were Greek-speaking churches, right? Whether in Corinth and elsewhere. Now, another theme that I think is going to be very important is the Gospel of St. John's statement about the identity of Christ, right? So, en arche en hologos, kai hologos en proston theon, kai theos en hologos, right? In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, right? And then later on in John's prologue, he says that the Logos was made flesh and dwelt among us, right? So this is, I think, one of the most important statements in the whole New Testament about its relationship also to the Greco-Roman world. So on the one side, the early Christian community, right, in a sense, was a Jewish sect which affirmed Christ's the messianic identity of Jesus, right? That Jesus is the Messiah prophesied by the Jewish prophets. But now in the Gospel of St. John, we're hearing that Christ is not only the Messiah of the Jews, but also the eternal divine Logos of the Greeks, right? So again, something that likely would have shocked both groups at the time on first hearing, certainly. So this again is this idea of Christ as sort of the fulfillment of the ages, including of what was spoken of in the Greco-Roman world. So I think that covers what I'd want to say about the New Testament. I'll move on to sort of the reception of Christianity in the classical world and Christian responses to classical critics and so forth in a moment. But was there anything you want to say about that, Moss?
Perhaps only very quickly, just in terms of the bridge between St. Paul and John, that change in transmission between people who knew Jesus in the flesh and we're disciples by that, to those reached by Logos has happened, right? Because Paul is not only, as Saul, a zealot, but he meets Christ not in the flesh, but although in a spectacular way and with some emblems of force, you're knocked off your horse on your way to, but through a kind of universally accessible principle. So I mean, he meets the figure of Christ as Logos, not as man.
Yes. So I mean, again, we have this idea of St. Paul as sort of this bridge figure between these two worlds, as it were. And so we're also having this transition from the historical character, the historical figure of Jesus, whom the apostles knew as a man, but also came to believe was God among them, right? To the emergence of a world religion, right? The emergence really of a world religion. Okay, so in other episodes, not least the one we did on the Byzantines, we discussed the political conflicts and ultimately conversion of the Roman Empire by Christianity, the political element of that. So I don't want to go over that too much again, but I want to discuss in this one more the intellectual interchange between Christianity and the classical world. So, okay. So, what was the initial critical attitudes, right, of the, let's say, the Greco-Roman intelligentsia? What was the sources of opposition? Well, the one thing that to mention would be that it was emphatically not the idea of there being one God, right? Because that had been, in fact, you'll see in some of these writings that was something widely accepted by Greco-Roman intellectuals, that there's one divine being. In fact, so here gives you one example. So part of it was probably just the sheer foreignness of the new religion, right? The fact that it came from outside of the Greco-Roman world. So Maximus of Madura is writing to, he's actually has a fairly friendly, he's a practitioner of the old religion, but he has a fairly friendly interchange with St. Augustine, right? And he says, who would ever be so frantic and infatuated as to deny that there is one supreme God, without beginning, without natural offspring, who is, as it were, the great and mighty Father of all? The powers of this deity diffused throughout the universe which he has made, we worship under many names, as we are all ignorant of his true name, right? He's in a sense going back to the unknown God, right? We don't actually know the name of this God. But what actually bothers, it sounds silly, but what actually bothers Maximus of Madura are the names of the Christian saints, which have these Semitic sounds, right? So he says it seemed almost as if a second campaign of Actium had begun, in which Egyptian monsters, doomed soon to perish, dared to brandish their weapons against the gods of the Romans, right? So if you read Virgil, he depicts the battle of Actium, right, against Cleopatra and Egypt, right, as this battle between East and West, right? Again, this battle between Europe and the Middle East and Asia, right? And they had conquered them at Actium, and Maximus of Madura is kind of saying, now the battle is being renewed in some sort. Rome is being spiritually conquered by this new force from the East, as it were. So part of it would be the simple xenophobia of there being a foreign religion coming into Roman territory and sort of taking over. So that would be sort of one element. Another thing would be just so the Greco-Roman world, it was a world which revered culture and education as being among the highest values. But the early world of the early church made its appeal especially to the poor and the marginalized, even the slaves, right? I mean, this was sort of this appeal. If you look at the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, right? So there's this kind of appeal, and St. Paul says that there's no difference between the slave and the free, right? Every human being has a spiritual dignity. And so it won many early converts from these, from let's say the lower and less educated classes. So this is one of the things that Celsus, writing in the 2nd century, has against the early Christians. So Christopher Dawson writes also. So he says that the golden mediocrity, that is to say, the golden mean, right, of moderation, or of the classical scholar, could have little sympathy with the fanaticism of the martyrs and the desert monks, who condemned everything that made life delightful and proclaimed the approaching doom of all secular civilization. Maximus of Madaura, the pagan rhetorician who corresponded with St. Augustine, speaks of Christianity as a resurgence of Oriental barbarism, which sought to replace the gods of the gracious figures of the classical deities by the cult of executed criminals with horrid Punic names, right? So you could see there's sort of, on the one hand, sort of a class bias and sort of a xenophobic sense that this foreign sect is taken over. And for their part, some of the Christians did not deny this element, right? So you have, with Tertullian, the existence of a we could say a Christian anti-Hellenism in some sense, right? So he says, human wisdom which pretends to know the truth while it only corrupts it, and is itself divided into its manifold heresies by the variety of its mutually repugnant sects. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church, right? So there you have this idea of the church and the academy of Plato, as it were, being radically separate, right? As being something different, and even a concern about philosophy as somehow potentially leading Christians astray. And Tertullian says, I call you not as when fashioned in schools, as when fashioned in schools, trained in libraries, fed in Attic academies and porticos, you belch wisdom. I address you simple, rude, uncultured, and untaught, right? so he's actually taking it as being a virtue, right? In some sense, right? The simplicity of the common man, let's say, as against the pride of the classical scholar, that sort of thing. So that's one angle, right? And Origen wrote an entire treatise refuting Celsus. Another important element, which probably played a role, particularly in the persecutions of Christians, was the idea that by luring people away from remember that the gods to the Greco-Romans were the protectors of the cities, and the idea being by luring them away from the worship of the gods, they were potentially withdrawing their protection, right, and bringing the anger of the gods on the Greco-Roman world. So this was perhaps one of the most forceful elements in the critique, let's say, of nascent Christianity. So that's kind of one angle. Okay. But there is another side to this in the early church. Justin Martyr, I think it was in the 2nd century, who had studied the Stoics and Aristotle and Plato and Pythagoras, right? So you're also starting to get converts in the church who are classically educated, we could say, as well, and were therefore able to start to answer the critiques. He said, Christ who appeared on earth became the whole Logos, body and soul. And he wrote a dialogue between a Jew, a pagan philosopher, and a Christian, right? Sort of kind of friendly debate among the three about ultimate issues. Of course, he ended up being a martyr, so maybe it didn't end that well. But even more important would be Clement of Alexandria. In the Stramata, and I should say that in general, among in the Greek Christian world, there tended to be much less of the anti-Hellenism, as you might expect, right, among people, among Greeks. So he wrote in his Stromata, accordingly, before the advent of the Lord, philosophy was necessary to the Greeks for righteousness. And he says, for God is the cause of all good things, right? But of some primarily, as of the Old and the New Testament, and of others by consequence, philosophy. Perchance philosophy was given to the Greeks directly and primarily till the Lord should call the Greeks. For this was a schoolmaster to bring the Hellenic mind as the law to the Hebrews to Christ, right? So in Christian understanding, the law was sort of a preparation among the Jews for the coming of Christ, the law and the prophets. Clement of Alexandria is sort of consecrating the Greek philosophy as being the preparatory for the Greek world. So I think that gives you something of a sense of the ambivalence of this relationship, right? I should say that there were also among the pagans certain Christian virtues which were admired by the pagan authors. The one most particularly, humility didn't really fly too much. It wasn't really, humility was not really a major part of the Greek self-understanding, but temperance was, right? So the chastity of the Christians was widely praised, right? Their restraint and control of desires was something widely praised. So even Celsus, I believe, was very vitriolic about Christianity, praises some of their virtues. Because among the philosophers, you had these things like, people who were converted from a life of sensual debauchery to the study of philosophy. I mean, they had people who had conversion experiences, and this was something familiar to the Greco-Roman world. And so they saw in the Christians some of the virtues which they already had understood. So I think this probably, hopefully, reflects some of the ambivalence of the early encounters. I will move next to Augustine and successors, but maybe I should pause there. Miles, did you have any thoughts?
No, I'll offer just one or two questions or thoughts at the end, but this idea of the church becoming the standard bearer in some ways for the classical tradition step by step is really interesting. I think people want to hear that. So.
Yeah, so Augustine, I mean, this idea of philosophy as preparation for Christianity was in some ways kind of realized in the personal life of Augustine, right? Who, well, first of all, we should say he was thoroughly trained in classical rhetoric, right? And in his Confessions, he discusses how he was formerly living a life of sensuality, a sort of sexual promiscuity, he talks about, in the ordinary course of study, I lighted upon a certain book of Cicero, whose language, though not his heart, almost all admire. This book of his contains an exhortation to philosophy and is called Hortensius. And he said, I yearn for an immortality of wisdom and began now to arise, right? So his first turning away from the world of sensuality to God, right, in his Confessions is on the occasion of his encounter with Cicero, right? And from Cicero, he began to study philosophy, and eventually he comes to the Platonists and Neoplatonists, right? And he says, I think in the City of God, he says that he speaks of, he says that having read then these books of the Platonists and having been admonished by them to search for incorporeal truth, I saw your invisible things and understood by those things that are made. And though repulsed, I perceived what that was, and through the darkness of my mind, I was not allowed to contemplate, assured that you were and were infinite. So we see, and he calls Plato, who justly preferred to all other philosophers of the Gentiles, right? So we see that it's Plato who first gives him a conception of the incorporeal divinity. because I guess he had been somewhat materialistic in his mindset. He couldn't imagine a kind of being which would not be, physical, and he, his soul was very inclined toward the physical, sensual world. And Plato, with his notion of the ascent of the soul to the invisible and changeless, he also credits then with turning him from the mutable to the immutable, right? And this really impacts Augustine's entire notion of, let's say, what sin is. What is sin? It's turning away from the immutable, changeless good of God to the changeable things of this world. Well, I mean, there's a lot to say in terms of Augustine's assimilation of classical rhetoric, which he employs regularly. Cicero is a constant reference, right? So he's clearly a figure who, though Christian, is thoroughly immersed in the classical tradition. And the last thing that I would say is, so what you have toward the end, as the Roman civilization per se begins to die in the 5th and 6th centuries, and you have this decline of the classical tradition, virtually the one place where it remains vital by the end of this process is the Catholic Church. Right, so as the libraries, what was it, Aminianus Marcellinus was saying, the libraries are closing forever like tombs, right? You have this dying classical world as the dying in one sense. The libraries are closing, the cities are closing, the barbarians are entering the gates, right? This dying world. But then you have figures like Boethius trying desperately to translate Aristotle into Latin for posterity, and he writes the Consolation of Philosophy. He's unfortunately executed by Theodoric, I believe, before he could complete that work, which was completed then in the 12th century, just before Thomas Aquinas and scholasticism and all that. But you have the effort to make available the classics. And then you have Cassiodorus, who gathers many of the books into his vivarium and sort of takes over and sort of creates a curriculum, as it were, for the monasteries, right, that were emerging, based upon the 7 liberal arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, right, which is going to be a classically based curriculum. So really, in spite of this initial tension, right, between we could say the church and the classical world, by the end of the classical world, the church has really emerged as the ark in which the classics survive, right, as the Roman Empire falls to barbarism. So I think that gives you somewhat of an inkling about this this saga, which is really so foundational to the story of Western civilization as a whole. So pause there. So did you feel free to fire your questions or comments?
Well, I think that's really great, Alex. I think there's a lot of ground covered in a rather small amount of time. And I just was thinking, as you were speaking, back to the title you gave this episode, which is Conflict to Confluence. And I guess I had one sort of additional idea or question on each. So on the theme of conflict, the thing that occurred to me was the reverse of this question about philosophically minded Greeks being able to accept God as man. So not just as a person, but a humble person, basically an obscure person who didn't write except in the dirt. And so what seems to be on that theme totally new about Christianity is an infinite God. So one in some ways like Aristotle's prime mover, remote and infinite, but also a God of infinite condescension, because stoops down to aid not just people, but the worst of people, sinners, humble people, people who don't have the status that the classical world in its haughtiness would have preserved. So it's a question about hierarchy on the conflict side, and then on the confluence side, what I was thinking about was the issue of diversity. We spent a fair amount of time talking about the exchange, the mutual interest, and also the tensions between the classical world and the Judeo-Christian world. But of course, the classical world itself contains this diversity, and that seems to unpack through the Christian era that you just introduced. I mean, I guess if someone thinks about the early Christian world, the Middle Ages, and the early modern world, there's this kind of patristic to scholastic to humanistic succession that people have in mind. There's a lot going on in there, but I mean, some of it is an oscillation between Platonic and Aristotelian and Stoic influences, and I guess those differences, that diversity within the classical world is cultivated and developed and rediscovered through the Christian era. And I guess, you know, the flip side on that conflict and hierarchy side is people in parts of the Greek-influenced Christian world, unlike the disciples who came to understand that a man could be God, struggle to retain the idea that God could still remain man, right? There's this difficulty in keeping the fully human aspect of Christ in view when he is logos. Is that fair?
Yes. I mean, now your questions had a lot of parts, so let me try to unpack them in order. So on the first part, so I would say on the one hand, the idea of the gods being man-like was probably not that that part was probably more shocking, if anything, to the Jews than to the Greeks, right? Because to the Jews, the idea of an incarnate God, that was, well, when I say the Jews, I mean, let's say rabbinical or rabbinical Judaism. That was a kind of a stumbling block there. But the other part, you know, but because you had in the Greek world demigods who were half man, like Hercules and so forth, right? Yeah. But the second part was definitely the kicker, as it were, is the idea of God who's a carpenter, right? I mean, God he works with his hands, which was considered quite lowly in the classical world, right? To busy oneself with that sort of thing, and he surrounds himself not with the most lettered figures for the most part, right? Christianity begins with fishermen and tax collectors, right? I mean, and sort of the general idea of whosoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whosoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So there's kind of an overturning of sort of what would have been considered the hierarchy, the normal hierarchies of the classical world. And so it was really only later that your intellectuals began to flood into the church, and latest of all, within the span of the Roman Empire, that the emperors themselves embraced Christianity. So we see that pattern, right? It starts with fishermen and ends with emperors, in a sense, that saga, right? So that's definitely, yes, we could say a point of tension. Okay, so another element of tension we could say was with the but on the point of the incarnation, right, would be the idea of the passible and changeless mixing with the passible and changing, which is still a concept people have difficulty wrapping their minds, you know, the divine and human nature. The whole notion of the dual nature of Christ we discussed with the Byzantines, how fraught that was, and what kinds of conflicts even different interpretations of that could generate. But yes, you also made a point about so you saw some forms of Christianity which had more, I mean, this was actually more common, that they'd have more problems with the humanity of Christ actually than with the divinity. So you had Docetists who denied that Christ had a human body, and you had various types of Monophysites and so forth who tended to emphasize the divinity so much that the humanity started to get lost. But anyway, that's a long theological issue, but yes, you can see that sort of issue emerging of how do we reconcile these two things. Now, I think there were other parts to your question.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I just wanted to raise that issue in miniature, but then on the confluence, I mean, we have other videos in which people can look at our sort of civilizational march, including looking at Byzantium on its own, looking at the Middle Ages, and looking at the Renaissance on its own. But this kind of patristic, scholastic, and humanistic eras, you know, with Augustine and others, through whom the church becomes the protector or the guardian of the classical tradition, there's an enormous amount of diversity there, and there's a kind of centuries-long undulation, among other things, between Aristotelian and Stoical and Platonistic influences.
Yes. So if you notice you notice Augustine said that Plato is the most justly revered of the philosophers. The one problem was that Plato was not successfully preserved. except for one book, the Timaeus, which was translated by Chalcidius. I should mention that as an aside. But Plato was virtually unknown in the Middle Ages proper. They couldn't read Greek. But when Aristotle was translated first in the 12th century, and so you had the Aristotelian, so you had various syntheses, we could say, of Greek and biblical thought. First one is what we discussed today in the patristics. Then there's another one in the scholastic era in the 12th and 13th centuries, which is primarily Aristotelian. And then in the Renaissance, you have Platonism, right? Ficino and this great, Plato is finally translated, and there's this great Platonic issue that emerges, right? And then so you have the different schools of Aristotelianism and Platonism. And then, of course, you also have the biblical tradition, which at points resurges. I mean, it's at points notes of the anti-Hellenism kind of emerge, right? Luther refers to the Maccabees in his polemic against the Catholic University and so forth, right? But also they were Catholic figures as well. Bernard of Clairvaux was a skeptic of the Greek rationalist, and you have the Franciscan tradition, which is not as rational. So what I mean. So we have, the Western tradition is very obviously remarkably pluralistic when you have these three streams of the Greeks, Romans, Jews, and the Christian synthesis running through it, right? So it's so this is probably part of the secret of its historical dynamism. Yeah. Fair enough.
and not to fail to mention, of course, the other thing recurrent in the Renaissance and humanistic era is a rediscovery of rhetoric and Cicero and other Stoics. And we do have a course on rhetoric. And if people want to learn about that extremely morally and psychologically and practically rewarding discipline, they can contact you at the email below to look at joining that course.
Absolutely. And right, since our, so it's probably apropos to end a video series on classics and the advent of Christianity by wishing everyone a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, and hope that you continue to follow our videos, and hopefully some of you will even take our courses. So take care, everybody.
Merry Christmas, everyone. See you next time.
Take care.